Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to discuss Kindred by Octavia Butler, which is an amazing fusion of science fiction, historical fiction, horror, to create what I think might be Butler's most fully realized novel. It's an absolute masterpiece, published in 1979. Although I will add, The Parable of the Sower is also a masterpiece. But Butler uses this book to really interrogate a lot of assumptions that readers, and I will say readers from the US and Europe, probably make about those different genres. And to ask thought-provoking questions of the reader and of those assumptions that we make, because she's dealing with time travel. But it's not romantic, heroic time travel where a character from the present can go back in time and knowing the past, knowing the future, having a better grasp of medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, become this great leader and be able to take advantage of all those talents. Our character, the character we're traveling with through time, our narrator, is Dana Fairbanks, who's a Black woman. And she is ripped from her time, from her home, from her family, sounds like a parallel, to a slave plantation in Maryland in the earlier 1800s up through about the 1830s. So a whole generation and a half before the Civil War will occur, and any of the slaves that she's interacting with on that plantation will be freed. And there, we as readers see her experiences with slavery and how horrifying it really is. There's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing to glamorize about this life on the plantation. It is a true horror story. And the Butler's not really interested in the mechanics of time travel. It's not something that, that Dana Fairbanks isn't going and outfitting a DeLorean or outfitting, some weird Victorian machine that is with a gadget that takes her through time. She is truly ripped from her time, and she suddenly feels dizzy and just is pulled back into the past because she has to save a white man who's living there. And initially he's a boy, and over time he grows. And there is a way, I don't want to spoil it, but there is a mechanism that allows Dana to travel back to 1976, to her family there, to her husband, her home. And she can grab painkillers. She can grab a map of Maryland. But what Butler allows us to see is that even with all of that knowledge, all of that agency, in the slave-owning South, Dana is limited in what she can do. Even with all that, could she go and successfully run away and escape to the North? There's nothing romantic about the book, and it works fabulously well. Butler never quite lets up because she takes us into the deep horror, but she also gives us just enough light. She gives Dana, her character, just enough light, and she gives the readers just enough light that we continue want to see, okay, what will Dana be able to do to persevere and work and collaborate with these other characters, these other slaves. We get to meet Carrie, Sarah, Nigel. We get to know all of these, Alice, all these other characters, and we see how she's trying to use whatever agency she has to empower them in some way, knowing that she has some hope. And as I said, it works fabulously well, but it can be a very grim book to read and to spend time with, because the true trauma, the viciousness of slavery, not just the violence, but families being broken up when children are sold or a spouse is sold, the awful violence done towards people and the sexual violence towards women. That's a key component of the book. It's made clear very early on, and the title has sort of a double play, that the person who is pulling Dana back from the future to this plantation, Rufus, is a distant ancestor of her own, and that she is going to gradually find her, connect with a great grandmother there on that plantation. And so she's constantly trying to find this humanity in her own ancestor, even though he's a slave owner, even though she sees what he does. And sort of, as much as Butler is playing with that, this is how horrifying it was, but these were human lives, and these were people who in moments, whenever they could, they would snatch those moments of life and value them. She kind of allows us to see the other side of that with the character of Rufus, where he is reprehensible, he is, awful. His father, the older plantation slaver, Tom Whalen, is awful. And we see those aspects, we see these moments where they too can be human. Just these moments of humanity when they're not inflicting those horrors. But it really is a fantastic book. Butler goes in, and we do get a couple of people mentioned: Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. Her characters don't interact with them at all, but she sort of notes this parallel of like, I need to not take, for example, I need to not take a book on slavery back with me because somebody might read it and then try to like go prevent any of them from escaping. And so there's this consciousness of like, what can she take back with her to give her a little bit more agency to protect herself, but that's also not going to, create these insurmountable problems for her for however much time she has to spend back there. And we see that they are different amounts of time that she has to spend there in the slaveholding South before she can return to her own time. And I don't want to spoil too much of the book because it is absolutely fantastic. I think a lot of people have experienced this book, but I went back and reread it this year and just found so many ways in which Butler maintains this flow of the narrative, that we're given these little glimpses of the world, and the chapters get longer and longer as Danish journeys get longer. And so the world building occurs in a very subtle way until we really spend a lot of time seeing these characters develop and seeing the ways in which Butler is crafting these very distinct characters there among the slaves on the plantation, really, and giving them the little agency that they have, using that to build their identities and the aspects of their lives that they value and cherish the most, and the hopes that they have. So I would highly, highly recommend this. This volume from the Library of America also has Fledgling, which is sort of on the other end of Butler's career. And then the whole set of her short stories and even some essays and articles where she is very explicit about wanting to challenge those assumptions around who gets to be the hero in science fiction, who gets to be the hero in historical fiction, whose voice is heard, who gets to be the agent. So this is highly, highly recommended. She, of course, drew very clearly on histories, including specifically the slave narratives. And I think it's very important that rather than just reading books about that time period, spending some time with primary documents, like actual narratives from escaped slaves or freed slaves, is critical to understanding that. Toni Morrison's Beloved, I think, is probably the greatest example of a novel dealing with that time and dealing with the true human cost. Additionally, I was reminded of the great Charles W. Chestnut, who was writing in the 19th century, really, and has some marvels in his short stories. Additionally, the portable 19th century African American women writers edition that Penguin Classics did is fantastic. There are some ways in which Butler draws a modern parallel. So the book's set in 1976, it was published in 1979. At that time, of course, South Africa is under apartheid, and that is explicitly referenced by Butler. So I was thinking, of course, of Steve Biko, who Cry Freedom is probably the work most people are familiar with, the work about Steve Biko, but he was a key leader in the anti-apartheid movement and was murdered. And this is basically transcripts of interrogations and testimony at a trial in which he was using it to interrogate the concept of apartheid, but also Sipho Sepamla's Ride on the Whirlwind, which is a really, really interesting book, really almost contemporarily written to Kindred, and is set there in South Africa in the 70s. I mentioned, of course, Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. I think there are ways in which this is very clearly a book that Octavia Butler is taking and trying to invert in some interesting ways. The Time Machine from H.G. Wells would, of course, be another. And then Nomad of the Time Streams by Michael Moorcock. I haven't found any in the essays reference of Butler reading Michael Moorcock, his time travel books. But The Land Leviathan is a really interesting one in which characters acquire technology in Africa and then work to desegregate the U.S. a couple generations early. And I did a video on that about 2 years ago, so I'll link that in the description box below. A young Paul Robeson is a character in that book. A couple of last quick references: The Known World from Edward P. Jones, a more recent book, sort of questioning ideas around slavery and the different ways in which African Americans or freed Africans found different roles within that society, and sometimes to a degree that was very harmful to those who were slaves. Another one would be The Shrinking Man from Richard Matheson, really only because of this way in which, as Dana Fairbanks, the heroine in Kindred, gradually acquires some level of agency, she also, because of the time travel, has a sense of knowing kind of what's going to happen, and even at certain times of time when something might happen. And that gives her this sense of almost like fatalistic prediction that I think Matheson is exploring in The Shrinking Man, with this idea of like he can calculate how much more time he has. And it adds this level of existential despair / hope, kind of inverting on that coin. And then the last book I was reminded of was In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes, where she is very explicitly interrogating a lot of the misogynistic tendencies in crime fiction and in noir in her book. And I think doing a fabulous job of that. I think Butler sort of does the same with science fiction in Kindred. So let me know if you've read this one. I love it. I'm not sure when I'll reread Fledgling or a different work from Butler, but she is one of those authors I like to return to. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.